Good morning to all of you. Let me get my timer set up here. Thanks. It's a distinct pleasure to be here. I'd like to acknowledge the president and the mayor and the principal and the future principal for having us here, the hosts and the organizing committee, and to my friend Mikael Jakob, who extended the invitation to begin with. It's a stunning place to arrive at off of a long plane ride. And I was able to take advantage of the seaside here, the parks, even swam in the lake yesterday. So I feel like I've had a little bit of the local experience. I think the topic you've put forward is a ripe topic for a ripe time. In an era of climate change, rapid urbanization, social inequities, and cultural debate, landscape, I believe, offers a profound and functional and inventive starting point for rethinking the ways we live. New forms of interdisciplinary, collaborative, entrepreneurial, and research-based landscape practices might better address the complexity of issues confronting contemporary society and might offer a more expansive view of and for landscape architecture and landscape urbanism as disciplines. In this way, new practices might be understood to address broader topics or issues that require interdisciplinary thinking, to experiment with recurring concepts over multiple projects, or they might at least start work with broader questions for exploration, to redefine the scope and scale of the projects and possibilities yet to be defined, rather than simply attempting to find solutions to already stated problems or briefs. Stoss, my firm, is formulated in just this mode, a practice generated from ideas and centered on design, and a hybrid studio informed and cross-pollinated by research, experimentation, and teaching. I really started the practice with a question and a research project. The question was this: how might landscape play a more prominent and formative role in the imagining and remaking of public spaces, infrastructures, and entire cities? Not as a piece of leftover thinking, but as something that really generates new ideas for design and new ideas for the ways in which we live. The research project resulted in this article called Public Works Practice in Charles Waldheim's Landscape Urbanism Reader. And here I looked historically at a number of key projects throughout North American civil engineering history. And I was looking for ways in which these projects demonstrated interdisciplinary thinking and even entrepreneurial practices within the scope of really broad-reaching projects. Through the practice, we explored some of these ideas at multiple scales using design competitions, this for the Lower Dawnlands in Toronto, Canada, a new proposal for urbanism really built on the fish or the breeding habitats of fish in the river we were trying to restore. So how is it that we begin to think about ecology as a starting point for remaking the way that we live in dense urban cities? We also did a few experiments in free play and creativity, understanding that people are quite inquisitive creatures. How is it that you create familiar topographies, unprescripted landscapes, and allow people simply to engage their imagination and their physical bodies in exploring these places? For us, it was a great way to begin to think through the way that people can potentially simply engage with a place, no matter what shape or form it might be. I also had the opportunity to teach early on, and did a number of seminars and studio projects that really looked at the ways in which we might recalibrate single-minded infrastructures from the 20th century into much more multidimensional infrastructures that could take on other agendas, ecological, environmental, social, cultural, economic, for the decades and centuries ahead. So with that as a starting point, what I wanted to do today is just simply explore a number of starting points for us, both in the practice and in my own teaching and thinking. The following three broader topics, I think, offer insights into the ways in which we might use contemporary ideas and techniques borrowed from or in collaboration with other disciplines, as well as contemporary tools and approaches to real-world issues that might better address the complexities and challenges at hand. So the first of these topics is the idea of flux, flows, oscillations, the idea of being in a continuous state of continuous change. This, of course, is an idea derived from complex adaptive systems ecology, in which the world and its ecosystems are dynamic, constantly shifting, adapting, evolving to environmental and human-influenced conditions. And as Christian pointed out, these were ideas that we were able to explore through research and this book project with the planner and ecologist Nina Marie Lister, in which we engaged contemporary thinkers in the natural sciences and in the design arts to begin to think about where the project of ecology is and where it might be going. But we also use the opportunity to find overlaps between the ways in which we worked. Stuart Pickett at the conference that kicked off this book project noted that ecologists and designers both work with drawings and models. Ecologists can't experiment on the ecosystem at large. So in a lot of ways, we develop our ideas through drawing and modeling. And with this idea of a kind of starting point for conversation, I've been able to explore these ideas in a number of different venues. Teaching at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, we've looked at the ways that adaptive ecologies at work in places like Jamaica Bay in New York City might set the tone for a different kind of adaptive urbanism project that might constantly shift and change in response to environmental informants. We also had students look at analogs of these ideas. How is it that we might think through interactive real estate games and scenarios that might allow for the building of more robust ecologies? At the same time, it allows for densification of the urban environment, where development here leads to a better environmental state rather than putting this question into debate or as an either-or. Within the practice, we've explored these ideas at a couple different scales and sometimes in very, very simple ways. A project on the waterfront in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we were simply trying to revive environmental dynamics on this industrial-filled site. And it's a very simple strategy where we redirected on-site stormwater moving across the site, allowed it to infiltrate the ground, more importantly, collect in the lower area of the site to reestablish and reinaugurate a dynamic natural marsh, a marsh that the infrastructure and industry of this place once displaced. We were using some of the protective infrastructure to help reestablish this marsh. And the marsh is really quite dynamic and beautiful. It has many different seasons to it. It has many different characteristics to it. And just the simple change in season allows for a reading of environmental dynamics right in the city. We also cut slots into the existing bulkhead wall so that at high water levels, the river would invade the space. So giving water space within the city was really quite important. There are also a set of material ecologies at work here. The very specific relationship between the rusted steel bulkhead wall, the really soft and lush marsh plantings, and these new fiberglass seating and lighting elements for us put in play a conversation between the natural, if you will, the industrial, and a bit of the technological. And of course, all of it is there to really embrace people and really understand that the dynamic that we're interested in here is as much social as it is ecological. Taking the idea one more step, how is it that we can bring sustainability to life in urban spaces? Working at the University of Michigan, a project where we're trying to capture all the site stormwater in these 5 very lushly planted infiltration gardens. Here we were interested not only in creating a beautiful garden and performing the function that was required, but how is it that we can really bring this ecological function to life so that it's experienced in wonderful ways by people. So here we're developing an environmentally responsive lighting strategy, one that's integrated within the gardens. You can see the little light fixtures here below the mature bald cypress trees. And the idea is that every time water enters that system, the lights will flicker. So at that moment where it's most miserable, most cold, most rainy, where people want to run away as quickly as possible, we've brought this garden to life in ways that really make you want to linger and really have a wonderful effect on the ways in which that people might experience this place. Some of the tests, this was just last Thursday. The elements are going in and being tested right now. And so it's an exciting moment for that project. And one of the first opportunities we've had to do something with a little bit of refined technology in it. Now, this idea of ecology and flux, I think, is social as well, right? The ways in which people adapt public spaces for their own uses, for uses that weren't necessarily intended. On the one hand, we need to design for public use and accommodate people, but on the other hand, we need to acknowledge that people will do their own thing, like these ladies. They could have sat in the cafe, they could have sat in the cafe chairs outside the cafe, but they chose to find their own space. That's where they're most comfortable. And so how is it that you design for this kind of open-ended way in which people will explore the public realm? This is the project Christian referred to at Harvard University, situated on a bridge that was really designed to allow for cars to go under and pedestrian flow over. But the project here was, how do you bring this space to life socially? The president was really interested in making this the center of social life on the university campus. And so it's a project that in many ways is about accommodating movement through. It's about offering many opportunities for people to simply linger and stay in a place. And it's about, in some ways providing movable chairs, but also these more abstract, you can call them benches, but elements that allow people to sit and lounge and play in different ways. You can sit there and scratch your belly at midday if that's what you choose. But they're very open-ended. They're very inviting. They're positioned to allow people to sit in different ways, in different combinations with people, and they respond differently to the different kinds of bodies we all have. It's also a space that's set up to host a number of different changing activities. So the surface, even though it's quite simple looking, is really embedded with foundations and utility hookups, water, power, et cetera, so that any number of different activities can actually occupy the space. So as part of the design process, we were looking at the scripting and scoring of these different activities and the ways they might inhabit the space. And that allows really for a constantly changing mix of activities, whether it's markets or performances, student boxing matches, skating, curling exhibition. Last winter, memorials for the Boston Marathon bombing, and even student protest. And it's become a space that's iconic at the heart of the campus, incredibly successful simply because it takes on these same ideas about ecological adaptability and dynamics and choice and diversity, and really scores that into a public space. Even the infrastructure of this space. This is the crash wall that prevents trucks from leaping over the edge and crushing the cars below. Even that infrastructure is civilized in a way, inscribed with wayfinding and seating and bicycle parking, so that each of the elements of the project perform multiple functions in distinction to the existing piece of infrastructure, which really was set up to perform one. Second topic, generative processes. Here I'm thinking about relational and associative techniques and technologies, design that is neither static nor compositional, but dynamic, assemblies of forms and components that might be generated from a set of logics that can adapt themselves to circumstance or changes as projects are conceived and deployed. Here we're using tools and techniques that other design professions and other disciplines are using. We're thinking about construction and fabrication technologies, and we're thinking about ways in which their applications can be quite versatile, from the scale of furniture and the human body to the landscape and the site, all the way up to the scale of the city. These projects were early explorations in how you use dynamic and associative tools to begin to generate new ideas of flexible landscapes set up on a set of principles. This is a water collecting, cleansing system for contaminated runoff, and understanding that that system might be deployed in multiple ways depending on the condition and the ways in which those projects might hit the ground. And these are tools and techniques that we're exploring in many, many different ways at the GSD as a foundation for the way in which landscape architects might begin to think about the making of landscapes and cities. And of course, you saw those same tools and techniques being used in the benches at Harvard. This idea of many, many, almost an infinite variety of combinations and prototypes were developed for the project. And we're working between analog and digital tools in order to test these for fabrication and installation. Again, each of these is built on a set of component parts, put in different combinations with one another, and then deployed in different ways on the site. Each of the ribs is numbered and can be easily replaced, using some of the same software technology to power the fabrication machines that we're using in the office to design the landscapes. Again, at the University of Michigan, this reinvention of a 4-acre quadrangle uses these same tools and techniques at the scale of the site. In some ways to generate a space for walking and gathering in many ways. But here we're using a combination of landform, seat wall, and seating elements in combination deployed across the site. You can see this project in a state of construction. This happens to be the final version of this, but the tools really allow us to study very quickly different combinations, different massings, different deployments in ways that set up different spatial and physical relationships and spaces for other kinds of program to play themselves out. Again, experiments with seating, we're finding that even though we started this project thinking about ourselves as urbanists, a lot of the work we're doing is really at the scale of the human. So these are concrete and metal benches built from a set of parts that can be put together in various combinations to create different kinds of seating arrangements deployed across the site in order to then create the kinds of flexible and diverse spaces that we were interested in creating here. And here you can see a couple photographs just from last week. The project isn't quite done, but they have opened it as the semester's beginning, and we're excited to see the finishing pieces of this come into place. Of course, these are some of the same tools we're now equipping our landscape architects with in school. So in the Core 3 Urbanism studio, this is one that Pablo Perez Ramos is here. He's teaching this semester. We're working with students to really think through in very iterative and quick ways how these tools and techniques can be used to generate landscapes in response to hydrology, landscapes in response to human use and activity, and really starting to scale that up so that these landscapes are then thickened to be embedded with infrastructure and ultimately with buildings, so that new forms of flexible, diverse city-making techniques are really put forward as what we can do. So the same set of tools being used from everything from the bench to a multi-hundred-acre urban district. I think these are the tools that give us possibilities and insights to kind of help move the profession and discipline forward. And finally, the third topic I wanted to talk about, dynamic frames, the idea of scaffolds that bring to light conditions or change, or that establish loose frames that might instigate appropriation, growth, and change, or dynamic and multifunctional infrastructures that themselves might be able to adapt to ongoing physical, environmental, social, political, and economic change over time. We had the opportunity recently to work with Howler Yoon Architects out of Boston on a project in Washington, D.C. On this bridge or former set of bridge abutments. And here the client was interested in this question of how do you take what was formerly a single-minded infrastructure and diversify that in many ways. How is it that you might make that a center of civic life? How might that help us establish connections to the river and environmental life? How is it that that bridge park might actually help close the gap between communities on one side of the river and communities on the other? So for us, it was all about making a bridge for people in many, many different ways. A connective infrastructure that might host a wide range of social activities, cultural activities, and really might be set up as an ecological infrastructure as well to enhance quality of environmental life, both for birds and fish on the one hand, but also for people. The very simple diagram was that the bridge might be an infrastructure that connects social and environmental networks at this one point of crossing across the river, and yet in many ways had to behave like traditional infrastructures do with certain clearances, structural requirements that behaved relative to the fluctuating water levels, and that was subject to the many, many different kinds of organizations that might have influence over a project like this. The strategy was to build a bridge from a kit of parts. And so when you talk about design strategies that are flexible, that allow for iteration, that might allow for different formations of a particular project, here we were thinking of how is it that we might use those same techniques and technologies, but even bring them into the public realm. How is it that we might identify a set of paths, activity infills, green surfaces, and clip-ons that then might be arranged in different ways? And this was an exercise we engaged in the office, but it was also a tool that we intended to use with the public as a way to begin to explore how is it that we might give priority to certain kinds of activities and uses that they were bringing to the discussion versus others. And this was a tool that would allow us to play those scenarios out in real time and really gave us a sense of going in to the project. It was a limited design project, not only being able to propose a solution to the problem, but showing that the project itself was quite flexible. And we had a set of tools that would allow us, through engagement, to find other forms of the project that might be as useful or even more useful as the project might play out. So, with that flexible kit of parts, we could imagine that the project itself might play itself out in different ways, according to different social priorities, according to different budgets, that overall the configuration of the elements might change, but individually within the project itself, certain pieces could be one thing or another depending on the set of conversations we were having and the set of priorities that we were putting out there. And so this is one demonstration of the project, the idea that a single pathway is multiplied and expanded across a larger surface, that surface is then thickened to accommodate different kinds of social program, and that the gaps within that are then filled to certain degrees with other kinds of activities and programs that might allow for bringing that project to life socially, culturally, environmentally. So you can see here the multiple pathways, the way the pathways thicken, the way the infrastructure accommodates planting and other forms of structure and social space. So that the bridge becomes a point of destination as much as it functions as a physical crossing. So with that, the project becomes a combination of different kinds of pathways that connect both on the bridge and to the surrounding neighborhoods on the edge. The pathways thicken to accommodate other kinds of social program and activity. The gaps within the paths are there to be occupied by different forms of play and recreation and art and culture and education. And the gaps are also a way to provide a number of different vantage points to and connections with the river below, whether the river is a backdrop for a musical performance, whether it's part of the view that you can take in from the green roof on one of the structures, or whether the river is this living, breathing entity that you can get down into with a school group. All of this was in play. There was also a specific agenda here that was ecological, a bit agricultural, a bit food-oriented, in a food desert within the city, a food desert both for native wildlife and for people. One of the questions was how can the project really serve to develop an ecological network that could feed humans, fish, and birds through the ways in which the planting was considered for the project. So anything from the development of fruit orchards on the banks to eating establishments at the center of the bridge to floating gardens and wetlands that would both clean the water and provide fish, food for fish and other forms of creatures. So in many ways, a multidimensional infrastructure that takes this idea of a single monofunctional piece of highway infrastructure and really transforms it in ways that help extend social, cultural, economic agendas within the city. We lost that competition. We lose a lot of competitions. In fact, that first competition I showed you, we lost that one too. And I've said a number of times that we're one of the few firms that have built our entire reputation on losing competitions. This is one that we built, that we won, but then it didn't have a prize or it didn't really have a project at the end of it. So I don't know if we really won this or not. This is in Dallas, Texas. I'm not going to yee-haw, but Texas is something else. I love Texas. This is downtown Dallas. So Dallas is a major metropolis surrounded by highways and a river. And this is a competition where at some point during the early 20th century, the river used to be here. You can see the remnants of the river, the Trinity River, and it used to kind of come up right really at the base of downtown. Well, it flooded downtown a few times, and did some damage and I think killed a few people. And so the city fathers at that point decided we need to move the river away from downtown. So they worked to move it here and built some big levees so that all the floodwater of the river would be contained with that. So it's a highly engineered river now. And as you can see, it's a decent distance from downtown. The problem is now, once Dallas moved its river, it then kind of missed that it moved its river away and wanted its river back. And so the question for this competition became, how do you reconnect the center of the city with that river, given that this kind of stuff really filled in that gap over many years? Now, there are many highway interchanges I've seen in my life. TxDOT is really good at building highways. I mean, really, really impressive. But it's not just highway infrastructure, it's rail infrastructure, it's the levees themselves, which make you feel tiny within this really big landscape. And it's also kind of quirky. I mean, as we were moving around, we discovered donkeys practically in the middle of downtown. This is a car wash and a really good taco stand, and a place where this owner keeps donkeys and zebras and llamas and longhorn cattle right at the edge of downtown. And so there's something quirky about this place and kind of rich and lively that we also wanted to play on with the project. So beyond the earnestness of what are we going to do here, how is it that we might capture this kind of ridiculousness in the project itself? So again, how do you connect the river to the city rather than thinking about thin landscape fingers or something, or even the idea of simply erasing the highway infrastructure, which is just inconceivable in a place like Texas? How is it that we might extend existing neighborhoods to the edge of the river itself? And in some of the more difficult spaces, the highway interchanges et al., how is it that we might very simply extend the river landscape back into the city itself, thereby setting up this kind of green grid alternating pattern within the city? In doing so, each of the new neighborhoods and some of the existing neighborhoods would have direct frontage on this new rich and robust landscape. At the heart of it, though, was how to revive the old river, which was still being used to collect all the city's stormwater before that water was then pumped into the levee system. At this point, though, these were pretty dirty and denuded ditches underneath the highway interchanges. And for us, it became a question of how do you bring those back to life? How is it that those can be cleaned up, that they can bring new ecological life to the city? How is it that they might form the heart of some of the new neighborhoods and open spaces? And so this is a highly re-engineered system that still deals with the basic requirements of flood control, but it's also set up to then spawn these other kinds of occupations and uses, anything from cleansing wetland gardens to new economic development initiatives for the neighborhoods to come. Some of the proposals were quite playful: a new urban beach within a mixed-use arts district, a very dramatic water amphitheater at the heart of a high-density new neighborhood at the foot of downtown, and then a series of water gardens at the south end of the site, again at the heart of a new mixed-use neighborhood. So water and aviary gardens that would draw on stormwater from the district and from the surrounding cities to put in place a new set of dynamic gardens that were as conducive to hosting these kinds of creatures as they might be conducive to hosting art shows and cultural events as well. So we're in the midst right now of engineering and designing this system so that you have water inputs, cleansing terraces, and that the water really is then brought into the central 20-acre open space that really allows for the playing out of stormwater dynamics within the city. We are actually moving forward with a developer on 120 acres of property here Here you can see the orchards and gardens as they're being designed and engineered. But the idea here is to really allow the stormwater and drought to bring to life the garden in the heart of this new district. That even at the most threatening moments where Dallas is being inundated by rain, that people are invited into the garden to really share in this experience that's at once environmental, social, and urbanistic. And really finding ways that gardens like this might become the heart of new neighborhoods, thereby becoming as much an economic catalyst as they are social, cultural, and environmental. So just to wrap up quickly, I think at the core of all this work is a dogged interest in the various ways in which multivariate landscapes, living, breathing, operative, might play a more formative role in the reimagining and remaking of cities, public spaces, civic infrastructures, and metropolitan regions, thereby bridging spatial, disciplinary, professional, and intellectual gaps. Thanks again.